Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Thursday, April 21st. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Notre Dame game is in 135 days, the game against Michigan in 219 days. Today we're going to wrap up our coverage of last weekend's spring game with a visit from everyone's favorite smart football friend, Ross Fulton. He is our X's and O's guru and always has some of the most insight into what we all watched on the field. And coming off that spring game, there's a whole lot to talk about. So Ross, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here, Tom.
So last week on the show, you talked about how, we went into lots of discussions about how basic they were going to keep the defense. And we heard it from Ryan Day. We heard it from Jim Knowles. But you said, even if they were keeping things very basic, we could learn a lot from what they considered basic, what they considered their base defenses. So what did you see on Saturday and what did you maybe learn from that?
Yeah, well, that's the irony. If that's their base or basic defense, then it's infinitely more complex than what they've run the last couple of years because they ran, I'd say, probably 10 to 12 more coverages than I saw probably all of last year during 13 games. So that's base, and that they didn't blitz at all. So that takes out a big chunk of what they would do. But they played, can go through the list. They played cover 0, no deep safety and run situations. They played cover 1. They played cover 2. They played cover 3. They played about half a dozen maybe versions of different types of man match cover 4 that we've talked about before on the show in terms of how that works. So, and then they did a bunch of drop 8 in different ways. So it was, I thought, again, so that kind of tells you where they're going coverage-wise, as we talked about last week in terms of what you see. And then, you still saw some of the techniques that we've talked about this winter, the defensive line trying to pinch or kind of, use heavy techniques to control the line of scrimmage. They want to spill the ball outside to the linebackers or, you get one of those two safeties depending on which side it is, and who sort of has been freed up as the free hitter in the coverage scheme coming downhill.
And one of the things that people may have noticed, this kind of popped out to me rewatching it on TV, was there were times when they had some really wide splits on the defensive line. Like the tackles were lined up over the guards or even on the outside shoulders of the guards at times, with no one in the middle, and it generally seemed like it was obvious passing situations, because obviously you're not going to do that if it's a running situation, right? So why do you do that? And is that something that they're going to have other variations on this fall?
Yeah, I think you do that, I guess, to generally speaking, improve your pass rush when you're less worried about people running up the middle. Conversely, we saw situations where they had the 4 defensive linemen inside and both outside linebackers over the C gaps, which is, something we've talked about Knowles likes doing. And then even then a safety may sort of come down. So essentially in some ways you're running, you're back to running a 4-3. It's just that now your safety is your middle linebacker. And again, then they're trying to spill the ball out. So, Knowles, my understanding is he talked about this during his coach's clinic as well. He likes to have calls, when, he wants to have answers to what the offense is doing, and he doesn't want to sort of leave it in leave the players having to sort of adjust. He wants to have calls to adjust. So again, and he likes to present different looks. So sometimes you're going to they'll line up wide like that, and then they'll pinch inside, and so the offense may expect something, or another thing that you can see is they will use the run techniques that I'm talking about of sort of trying to control the line of scrimmage, and if it turns into a pass play, then the defensive tackles will loop back around. So now you've reestablished contain on the quarterback, and you've reestablished those pass lanes. So he does move around, the defensive line quite a bit, and we'll see that even more this fall when the much discussed jack gets moved around to line up over the guard or stack behind the nose guard.
Yeah, however basic they were keeping it on Saturday, it felt like the offense wasn't running anything too wild either. But, overall to me, walking out of that stadium on Saturday, it felt like the defense held its own pretty well. You didn't have just constant busts in the secondary or anything like that. Is that, would you agree with that assessment? And then, if you do, it seems to me like that would be a very good sign for what they might be this fall in terms of a defense.
I do agree with that. I will say that's what I expected to see. I think even now people somewhat underestimate just like how deficient they were scheme wise, like compared to what other college football programs were doing. So like, no one was going to look good in some of those situations. No matter, you could have put an NFL team on defense. But that said, so then you put a competent coordinator with, they were very young. I mean, they have a ton of guys back. If you look at it, like they're very junior and senior laden on the defense. And when they're not, it's generally because they have really high level sophomores. So they, you would expect them to be pretty, I guess I have higher expectations than others do for what they can accomplish this year when you put those two things together.
So what was the biggest surprise to you? I mean, either positive or negative, and either offense or defense, I guess, from a scheme perspective on Saturday. What was your big, wow, one way or the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say I was glad to see on defense the amount of, as I said, cover 4 man match schemes that they were using. And that gives them a lot of versatility. As we've discussed, I'm a fan of those schemes, there's been some storm and drung about when they were playing cover 3, they were spot dropping, which is people have bad memories of that from the last couple of years. As we discussed, spot dropping is where you just drop to the zone area versus man match where you're playing man coverage and then you trade off based on what the receivers do. But I do think part of that is again, we talked about there's a lot of volume in his defense. So you gotta at some point sort of pick and choose your spots. And I do think a lot of the cover 3 that we will see is going to be used with zone blitzes or sim pressures. And so, you're sort of trading responsibilities around, and that simplifies a little bit. I would say, on offense, I was pretty impressed with Joe Royer and G. Scott. I mean, I think that they do provide, some different looks at tight end and the ability to use 12 personnel. And I know there's been some discussion this spring of why Ohio State doesn't use a tight end. Why do you want to play tight ends? Why do you want to play 2? And it's just because it creates so much. It makes it much harder to defend if you're able to use 1 or 2 tight ends because you have more gaps you have to account for as a defense. You have more possibilities in the run game. You have more run pass threats. And so I think that will add a dimension if they are able to sort of have, Stover as the inline tight end and then those guys in more of a, flex role. And then that doesn't even take into account Mitch Rossi, who obviously was a big part of things by the end of last year and I'm sure will be again in terms of being a movement fullback tight end type. So that does add a lot of versatility to the offense.
All right, well, you just mentioned G. Scott and Joe Royer as guys who really had not played a lot before, who kind of made a good impression on Saturday. Did you, that's always kind of one of the big takeaways for the spring game is the new shiny guy. And for a lot of people, that was Kai Stokes. So if that's your answer, that's okay. But, who were the young guys that you came away impressed with after watching that game on Saturday?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, lots of people have talked about Kai Stokes. Lots of people have talked about Evan Pryor. So I'll skip over them for now. This is the opposite of a young guy. I was impressed with Josh Proctor. For someone coming off a significant injury, he's learning a new defense sort of on the fly. He's changed positions. I mean, to me, he looks like you've got an NFL guy out there playing with younger college kids. And so that's a huge benefit to the Ohio State defense, assuming that he continues to come back and can stay healthy. And conversely, Ohio State's really, I know I said I wouldn't talk about Pryor, but Ohio State's really deep at tailback. I mean, I was impressed with Mayan Williams too. He continued, that move he put on Mitchell Melton was great. He has a lot of wiggle. In some ways, he too much wants to cut for being a big guy. And so, I just all around, obviously, I think the offensive line will remain a bit of a concern. I mean, they have 5 good guys. I mean, I think that people are sort of just assuming that Paris Johnson's transition is going to be seamless when I do think, there may be a little bit of growing pains. Obviously, he's going against, again, 2 more guys we could mention, and JT Tumalo and Jack Sawyer, who are just going to be too good to leave off the field in crucial situations. But, it's just real. It's hard at this point to find an area on the team where they're like, that's a big hole. I mean, tight end was solidified with Stover. You wouldn't necessarily say they're going to be like their best players, but they have some options there. If you're literally saying like our concerns are like our backup, who's our eighth offensive lineman, and then like we're worried about the safety position, but only because like guys like Latham Ranson, who's played a ton of snaps, is out, and then like Proctor's coming back, and like Court Williams, had a hamstring issue again. So it's just because of the immediate depth at the moment because of injuries. You should feel pretty good about that heading into the fall.
Well, my next question was going to be about your biggest concern for this team, but it sounds like there's not a particularly big concern on the team. So I guess let's talk about the safety position instead. I mean, you mentioned Josh Proctor. Seems like he's maybe taken a significant step to, A, being healthy, but B, also being ready to be a real contributor at that boundary safety spot. And then, Ronnie Hickman feels like something of, we didn't see a ton of Ronnie Hickman on Saturday, but it feels like they like what they have with Ronnie Hickman, and they have Tanner McAllister, who Jim Knowles obviously knows and just loves at that nickel spot. I mean, how comfortable are you with that safety? That those three guys, if they're the three starting safeties, and then Court Williams and Cam Martinez and Lathan Ransom and whoever else might be in the mix, kind of behind those guys. What's your level of comfort with the safeties right now?
High. I think that. I think people sort of undersell Tanner McAllister. He was really good. He's been really good for a number of years, and playing literally that role. I mean, again, I would say that Ronnie Hickman was probably the most dependable person on defense week in, week out last year. As I said about Proctor, and then I don't, going a couple weeks ago, what I would have said, I think that there's going to be an interesting sort of battle between Proctor and Court Williams for that boundary safety bandit spot, but I have trouble believing that Proctor can be kept off the field when he's fully healthy, because like he and Hickman also are so interchangeable. It just lets you do so many things, because like either can come down, either can play, some man coverage, either can stay as a deep quarter or deep middle safety. So, and that doesn't even mention, as again, then Williams. You have Latham Ranson, who's played, as I said, played a ton of snaps. So I think and then Kai Stokes. So, they should be in pretty good shape there. I mean, I'm trying to go back to, I hate to sound like, it's all roses. I mean, we'll still have to see sort of how the defense performs, when an offense is trying to attack it. I mean, as you mentioned, like Ohio State stayed very basic. Like they basically stayed in like 2x2, personnel the entire game. And not a lot of tempo. So, we'll have to see how the defense adjusts and sort of how the linebacker position works out. But I think they do have a lot of guys on defense who have played lots of snaps at this point.
All right, last question for you. Coming out of spring, give me your confidence level that this team is a minimally college football playoff level team, maybe national championship level team, as compared to where you were kind of going into the spring. How many of those questions got answered for you to at least a decent degree, as much as you can answer questions in the spring? To what degree did those questions get answered for you?
Yeah, well, since I like to rely heavily on SP Plus all the time, I mean, I will note that SP Plus has them as a pretty comfortable number one in the country coming into the year, which, a lot of that does have to do with, like, for a major college team, Ohio State has, like, a lot of production coming back, an unusually high amount. So that's a good place to start from. And then, everything with what Knowles is doing is sort of what I expect. I guess I would have been concerned more if, like, you had seen him, like, toning down some of what he does, at either because, like, the defense couldn't handle it, or because, like, internal politics, whatever it may be. But instead, like, even again in basic, like, I was just talking about coverage, but we didn't talk about, like, they were in a ton of, like, the three safety looks that Knowles used at Oklahoma State last year, like, far more than I even expected to see in the season, let alone in the spring game. And a lot of the same techniques. So, again, maybe I've put it on rose-colored glasses, but I think they're in a pretty good spot, as long as you have, C.J. Stroud and Jackson Smith-Njigba healthy, you're off to a good start from those two alone.
All right. Well, always nice to have a show where we're leaving people feeling good about the team. Had a bunch of shows last fall where I don't think that was the result of the conversations that you and I had. So always nice to give people something to feel good about. This is the time of year when everyone's undefeated, everyone's feeling good about their team. So sure, good job keeping Ohio State fans optimistic. I'm sure it'll last right until they give up the first down this fall. So
100%.
Ross, thank you as always for joining me. Make sure you check out all of our other great podcasts as well. We have Gives in the Bank, which Mark Givler and Bill the Bank Green do. Kevin Noon does Big Me Kickoff. Alex Gleitman has a fantastic episode of Around the Oval this week with Bryson Rogers. Tony Gerderman and I are going to be doing a new episode of the Buckeye Weekly podcast on Friday this week, answering your questions. So if you have not gotten your questions in, make sure you put those on. You can message us on Twitter at Tony Gerderman, at Tom Orr4. Leave us your questions. We're going to answer a bunch of those on Listener Question Show later on this week. You can find all those shows just by searching Buckeye Scoop wherever you're finding this podcast. You can subscribe right there. Leave us a 5-star rating review as well, which we do appreciate. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.